one of my reading goals this year was to read 12 classic books. I'm defining that as just anything that's older than 20 years that people are still talking about. I didn't go by like a list. I didn't look up the top 100 classics you have to read in your life. If I saw a book at the thrift store that I had heard of and I had wanted to read, I just bought it. And I was like, this is a classic. People are still talking about it. I'm going to read it. The average age of my 13 books, I was going to read 12, but I had to read 13. We'll get into it, was 1936, which is pretty good. Like, the average book is nearly 100 years old. That's a classic, okay? Unlike my 12 sci-fis, where most of the books I really, really liked, I have to rate these differently. So I'm going to have a section of, like, bad books, a section of boring books, and a section of good books. And in each little section, I'll go from worst to best. As usual, if I say anything that makes you think I would like a particular book, please recommend it below. Okay, let's get into it. So we'll start with the bad books. The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, published in 1920. So this is the worst book I've read so far this year. I hated this book. This book is about 3 of the worst people who have ever been written in a book. It's Newland, who's like a 30-ish New York lawyer. And you know that thing like gross 30-year-olds do where they're like, oh, I'm ready to settle down now. I guess I'm going to find a 19-year-old to marry, like the Joe Jonas treatment. Ew. He doesn't like Innocence. The titular Innocence is this woman May he's going to marry. But like he's like, this is what people do, I guess. And so he's engaged. And then he meets May's cousin, Countess Ellen. I think her name is Ellen. And he's like, whoa, women can have like thoughts? Oh my God. And so he gets married to May, but he wants to be with Ellen, and they're trying to be together, and he's just so torn up about it, but then he's like, whatever, and then he just spends 40 years married to May, and then she dies. Spoilers. At the end of the book, he's in Paris, and he's like, maybe I should go and see Ellen, and then he doesn't, because he's gross, and he's a loser, and they all deserve each other. They deserve unhappiness. This ending is good in that none of these people have a happy life because they don't deserve it. Oh, I should also say that this book was supposed to be funny. People said that it was a funny book, like, oh, it's a biting satire, and I don't want to read satire about rich people because, like, I don't need them to be satirized. Like, their life is satire, but also the only joke in this book is that there's a character that's fat. Like, the characters like her. She's respected in the town, and people enjoy her company, and they love her, but also she's fat, and, like, that's the joke. Like, she's just fat. I love Edith Wharton. I loved House of Mirth. I really like Ethan Frome, and the writing in this book is, of course, great. It's just I hated the story. This book won the Pulitzer Prize in 1921. It was the first female author to win the Pulitzer Prize, and why? Really? This was the best that they could do? In 1920, did people want to read about the Gilded Age? Did they want to read about rich people who had no problems and still hated their lives? Like, this guy is wealthy. He doesn't have to work, and he's just like, my wife doesn't like the same books I like. It's just blah. I'll tell you something embarrassing, though. The whole time I was thinking, like, in 1920, just after the stock market crash, but that actually happened in 1929. I don't know history, but now I know. So I guess instead of being surprised people wanted to read this in 1920, I'm more surprised that it held up. Because surely in the 30s, who's reading this? This is just the worst. I'm mad at the person who recommended this to me and said that it was like Pride and Prejudice, because no. 0 out of 10. Orlando by Virginia Woolf, published in 1928. So I think this book is really pretty. This is my first Virginia Woolf, and I don't know if you can see it right there. Like, this shelf right here is where I keep my 2 reads usually, like my TBR, and I found like a big stack of Virginia Woolf books, and I was like, surely I'm gonna love Virginia Woolf. And this was my first one, and I did not love it. There's some really beautiful passages, and this does have funny moments in it, but God, does this book say nothing. I picked this one to read first because it's Orlando, right? I love Shakespeare. Orlando, it's like gender bender, right? What an exciting thing to hear Virginia Woolf talk about gender, except she doesn't really. So Orlando is the story of like a young aristocrat. He's like from a very wealthy family, and he's very like beautiful and good looking, and he gets scorned by a woman, and he's like, fucking bitches, and he decides to be a writer, and he's bad at that. And then he's in the army, and one day he wakes up and he's she. Like, Orlando is now a woman. So he goes back to his big fancy house, and they're like, oh, you can't own this house anymore because you're a woman. And she spends like 200 years trying to win the lawsuit to get the house. And that's the plot. It's weird because what I felt Virginia Woolf was saying about gender was like, it's so hard for men, because women are bitches. But it's also hard for women too, because they're not considered people under the law and they can't own property. And I'm just like, Virginia Woolf, those aren't the same things. Those aren't equivalent. Like, Orlando as a woman never thinks of her past and feels shame about what she did as a man. Like, she's just like, I guess it's hard for both of us. And those aren't the same things. I read up on this book and I learned that this is like a joke. Like, it's like a gag where Virginia Woolf was writing with like her friend and lover, and it was like an inside joke between them that got published, and it reads like an inside joke. It reads like something you thought was really funny when you were chatting about it with your friend, but on paper it's so long and it's so boring and it says nothing. The Master and Margarita, Mikhail Bulgakov, published in 1967. So this book is about the devil going to Moscow because there are too many atheists there. So, like, everyone's doing philosophy and poetry and art, and then the devil shows up with, like, his minions, and also Jesus shows up too, and kind of wreaks havoc. And the moral of the story is, like, this is what you get for your atheist propaganda. So I didn't really vibe with it. It's not that I hate like stories with religion. Like, I really like Good Omens, for example. Like, I like the biblical mythology, but this was just like, I didn't understand the point. It was fine. I didn't love it. I didn't feel anything when I was done reading it. I think I missed the point of this. It's interesting because, like, if I really hate a book like Age of Innocence, I could just talk about it all day. I barely feel anything for this book. It was really long, and I didn't care for it. I actually only picked this up because I thought it was a classic sci-fi, and it's not. So now we are moving into the boring books. I don't have a lot to say about these. They were fine. I was just bored. Maybe if I had read them at a different time, I would feel different things about them. But the thing about boring books is that usually I would just not finish them. I would just put it down and read the Wikipedia page and be done. But because I was like challenging myself, I did finish these, which I think made me dislike them more. But these were just boring. Oh Pioneers by Willa Cather, published in 1913. First, again, I love this cover. This is why I like thrift shopping. Like, you can just pick up whichever cover you see and you like. I don't know, man. This is a Western, which I wanted to read for reasons that will become clear in the future. But it's a girl in Nebraska. Her dad dies and she's got to get the farm together. And there's like some romance in it. And it was just boring. It wasn't the kind of Western I'm into, I think. Is Nebraska considered the West? Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain, published in 1894. Pudd'nhead Wilson is the story of a lawyer who moves to a small racist town. I mean, it's during American slavery time, and he has this fun hobby of taking people's fingerprints. And then there's this simultaneous story of this enslaved woman who's raising her son, who is also enslaved, and her master's son, and she switches the babies because, like, they're both white. Like, she's like 1/16 black, and so her baby's like 1/32 genetics black, and so they both look the same. She switches the babies, and then, because of the ID fingerprints, like, it's found out later in the book. I just, like, this is a satire of racism. Mark Twain thinks racism is stupid and bad, and I agree. I really like Mark Twain, and I always think I'm going to enjoy reading his books, but I just never do. It's like I already knew what was going to happen after reading the first page, and I agree with Mark Twain that racists are bad and stupid, so I just, like, it just didn't do anything for me. I also really, really hate dialect in books, like, printed. Like, I hate that. It makes it really hard for me to read. So I didn't care for this. I like Mark Twain. I always expect that I'm going to like his books, and I never do. I like his essays more, I think. Miss Dalloway, Virginia Woolf, 1925. I tried another Virginia Woolf. I didn't like it. This one was so much better than Orlando. I felt that there was a point to this book. This book follows Miss Dalloway as she's planning a party, and like it's just a day in her life, which is a type of story I love. She meets like people selling flowers, and there's also this subplot about a World War I veteran who commits suicide. And it's just kind of her feelings on the matter. It's about an older woman, which is something I would love to read. I didn't vibe with it. This was very close to being in the good section, but I just found this a little boring. I get what it's trying to do. It's trying to be like a Ulysses, but about like a woman, and that's fine. I didn't vibe with it. I'm not sure if I should keep reading Virginia Woolf. So now we are on to the good book. So everything above in this list I would recommend, and I had a good time reading. I'm going to rate them with increasing how much I liked them. Like all of them were good, so it's not really worst to best. It's just what I would recommend if you have the same vibe as me when you're reading books. Okay. Something Wicked This Way Comes, Ray Bradbury, 1962. So I also thought this was a sci-fi just because it's Ray Bradbury, but this was a fantasy, and it was kind of a young adult novel, which I don't usually like. That was unexpected. This reminded me of The Twilight Zone, which I love. I used to watch The Twilight Zone every morning when I was in elementary school, and it felt exactly like an episode of The Twilight Zone. It also felt a lot like R.L. Stine, like those Goosebumps books for children. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a fun little like fantasy mystery romp. Big recommend on this book. Of Mice and Men, John Steinbeck, first published in 1937. Okay, so don't laugh, but I picked this book up from like my pile of books I bought at the thrift store because I had just finished reading Kindred, which I talked about in my sci-fi book, and it was just so harrowing and sad, and it just put me so down that I was like, I'm gonna grab something fun and light. And I picked up Of Mice and Men because I thought that it was about two dudes who like have like rabbits. That's all I knew about it. Two dudes had rabbits. And I was like, that seems fun. So I took it with me to a location where I had to sit for 90 minutes, and I read this in one sitting. And it is not a fun little story about two men and rabbits. I didn't read this in high school. This just wasn't on the list. I didn't know what it was about. That's on me. So this book is about George and Lenny. They're like a found family, and they're working as migrant farm workers kind of to earn money to buy their own farm. And Lenny is like a big dumb guy. Like he's got the mind of a child, and they have to keep moving because he keeps accidentally hurting women, I guess. And that's what happens here. Like they go to a new farm, they make the same mistakes, and it spoilers for this book that everybody knows the ending to but me. But George ends up having to kill Lenny because Lenny accidentally killed a woman. And yeah, that's the book. I loved this book. I love a short book. I thought that the characterization in this book was amazing. Like, it's so short, and yet you know these two men. Right away, you get who they are and why they're like this. And you don't need 700 pages to do that. It's a beautifully written, like, tight novel, and I really liked it. I felt very sad at the end. I loved the setting. It did make me want to read more John Steinbeck, which I have not done yet, and I'm going to do that. And I'm a little bit embarrassed because I feel like I'm going to say something that every single person who is watching this video discussed in a high school English course. I get it. You read this book in high school. It's a new one for me. But Curly's wife, she doesn't have a name, but also John Steinbeck writes it as if it's her fault that she gets murdered. Like, it's her fault that a man who doesn't know his own strength grabs her and shakes her to death. And it's not her fault. Like, just because she's like a flirty girl trapped on a farm by her husband who doesn't even say her name does not mean she deserves to die. And the book kind of makes it seem like she deserves to die. Like, it's her fault that she gets murdered, and it's her fault that George has to shoot Lenny, and it's her fault that George will never get to have his own farm. And it's like, he did it before. And I mean, I guess John Steinbeck did write about the event before. So maybe it's forcefully thinking you to think that. Like, this book is presenting you with, like, you're going to blame this woman, but you shouldn't. But I kind of got the vibe that John Steinbeck blamed the woman. Anyway, if you read this book in high school, what was the answer? What did the teacher say? There's this book out now called Julia by Sandra Newman, and I haven't read it yet, but it's a retelling of 1984 by George Orwell from the perspective of Julia, because that book also like wrongs its female characters. And I feel like someone should write Curly's wife. They should give her a name. From her perspective, this is a terrifying ordeal that ends in her murder. And everyone's kind of just like, ah, man, I guess we have to kill that guy now. And they're not like, oh my God, a woman is dead. I did love this book, though. I thought it was great. I thought the writing was great. I can imagine myself reading it again. And I think I've already found Grapes of Wrath at a thrift store and I've already bought it. So I might read that next. Or maybe I found East of Eden. Which one should I read? Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Anita Loos, published in 1925. So this is the story that the movie is based on. It was like a series of stories that were published in a magazine. And it's about this dumb lady who's beautiful and just takes advantage of men everywhere she goes. But she doesn't know she's doing it because she's just so dumb. So this book is about Lorelei Lee, and she's this beautiful, dumb girl who just goes around taking advantage of men. Although I don't think she understands that she's doing it. She's traveling through Europe because she was flirting with a man and another man didn't want her to do that, so he sent her on a trip, and she's just going through Europe, just stealing money from men and not knowing she's doing it. And she's so stupid, and I love her. I would die for Lorelei Lee. She's hilarious. She's so dumb. This book is very funny. I can't believe this was written in 1925. Like, you can just sit down and read it today and it just feels like it could be any time period. The men are so dumb. She is so dumb. This is a hilarious book. I had a great time reading it and I loved it. This copy also contains the sequel, which I tried to read and it was like really bad. So I don't recommend that. The Yellow Wallpaper, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, 1892. So this is the reason I had to read 13 books. I bought this on Thrift Books and I thought it was like a real book, but this is a very short story. It's like 20 pages long. I don't know if I would count it as a book. I'm putting it in here because it is a classic and I read it and I really liked it, but I did 13 total to account for this not being a book. This is a story about a woman with postpartum depression. Her husband is a doctor and he locks her in a room as treatment. And as you're reading it, you're not sure if she actually is having a psychotic break or if her husband is inducing this. And it's actually like very horrifying. Like, this was a scary book. Compare this to, I read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was supposed to be like a horror novel, one of the first horror novels, and it wasn't scary. Like, the horrible things Joel was doing, before he murders the man, was like being ugly and pushing a child down, and it's like, is this what horror counts for? This book, she sees a woman in the wallpaper and it describes her like arching her back and crawling and scratching on the floor. It's a horrifying story and I really liked it. I do know Charlotte Perkins Gilman because I know her as like an economist. She has this book called Women in the Economy and she talks about like the role of marriage and money in like women's safety and place in the economy. And I didn't know she wrote fiction. So I was really excited to read that and I really liked it. And I think you can just find it online. You don't need to buy it. It would take 15 minutes to read, but it was a great story. True Grit, Charles Portis, published in 1968. This is a Western. This was amazing. I loved this book. If you've seen the movie, it's just the movie. You know what this is about, or either of the movies. I think the Coen Brothers movie was more true to the book, but I also like the John Wayne movie. But this book is about Maddie Ross. She's avenging her father's death. She meets Rooster Cockburn. They go on an adventure. It's a great book. I really, really liked this story. It's just a fun adventure. And I was kind of worried the whole time I was reading this book that someone was going to, like, sexually assault Maddie Ross because she's a 13-year-old girl in this story. But, like, no. It's intergenerational friendships. It's a nice, yeah, she goes through some hardships, but like it's a nice story. I loved it. It was perfect. And I think one of the reasons I liked this so much is because I listened to the audiobook, which was narrated by Donna Tartt. Maybe I'll play a clip.
What business was it of Frank Ross to meddle? My answer is this. He was trying to do that short devil a good turn. Cheney was a tenant, and Papa felt responsibility. He was his brother's keeper.
So Donna Tartt just has this wonderful Arkansas accent, and I'm from Eastern Kentucky, and I love that Midwestern accent, and I just enjoyed every second of listening to this audiobook with her reading it to me. And this is actually why I read Oh Pioneers. I was like, I would love to read another Western, and then that book was just pretty boring. And I do like Westerns, like Lonesome Dove is one of my favorite books, but I loved this. This is now one of my favorite Westerns. I wonder if Donna Tartt read Oh Pioneers, if I would have liked it. I'm going to read a passage from Oh Pioneers in a country accent. Let me know if it gets better. It is 16 years since John Bergson died. His wife now lies beside him, and the white shaft that marks their graves gleams across the wheat fields. Could he rise from beneath it, he would not know the country under which he had been asleep. The shaggy coat of the prairie, which they lifted to make him a bed, had vanished forever. What do we think? I don't think so. It's still boring. All right. True Grit, though. This was great. Get your hands on True Grit. Despair. Vladimir Nabokov, 1965. So I said this book was written in 1965, but it was first published in 1937 in Russian, and then Nabokov moved to America, and he rewrote it and translated it into English and published it into 1965, which is this version. So this is 1965, right? This is the story of like a gross, disgusting weirdo who is like failing at his job, and he has this wife who he thinks is obsessed with him, but also like she's obviously sleeping with her cousin. And he goes to Prague, and he's not really honest with himself about what a piece of shit he is when he finds his doppelganger. This doppelganger is like a homeless guy, and he's like, oh my god, we look just alike, you should come and work for me because I'm an actor or something. And that's the plot. Let me read to you what it says on the back. Despair is the wickedly inventive and richly derisive story of Herman, a man who undertakes the perfect crime, his own murder. So this is my second Nabokov. I've also read Lolita a bunch of times. I also really like Lolita. He's really good at writing gross people who are the worst. And the stories are really fascinating because you're just like disgusted while you're reading it. And this has the same vibe. I would say Lolita is better, but man, do I hate this guy. Man, do I hate Herman. He's just so pathetic and gross, and he thinks he's a mastermind, and it all falls apart, and it's so embarrassing for him, and I really enjoyed this story. This book actually made me think about Age of Innocence again. Hang on a second. Here I am sitting here like, this book is about a guy I hate. He's disgusting and gross, and he's the worst, and he does horrible things, and it's a really good writer writing about how horrible this guy is. Where the worst book I read this year, Age of Innocence, I was like, I hate all these people. Like, the writing's fine, but I hate these people and they're the worst. And man, I'm glad that they all have miserable lives and they never find happiness. And it's just like, shouldn't I like this book? If I like Despair, shouldn't I like this? And I think the difference is my lack of media literacy skills. Like, I went into this knowing I was supposed to hate this guy, and I did. I went into this expecting Pride and Prejudice, and I did not get it. So I'm interested if I had known, like if someone handed me this book and was like, it's kind of like a romance between the three worst people you've ever met in your life, I would have loved this, I think. But because someone handed it to me and was like, you know, one of the greatest romance stories of all time, this is just as good, I was like, no, this is awful. This is the worst book in the world. So if you haven't read this yet, try to read it knowing that it's a Nabokov style. Oh my god, you'll hate all these people. And let me know if you like this better. Grendel by John Gardner, published in 1971. So this is a retelling of the Beowulf myth from Grendel's perspective, the monster. And this book is so weird, but so beautiful, and so... I loved this book. I love Grendel. Grendel just walks through life like he's bored. He's bored of the myth. He's bored of his role in eating the humans. He's mad at the earth, and he's mad at the sky, and he's mad at language and how he can't communicate the way he wants to communicate. And he's mad at the humans because they're so stupid. And he's annoyed that he has to deal with this. And he's annoyed that he has to die, and he will die. And it's not till he decides to jump into a giant pit and end it all when he's like, is this joy? Is this what I feel? And I mean, honestly, relatable. I loved this book. If there's any book in this list that I'm gonna read again, soon-ish, it's Grendel. I enjoyed this book so much. It's so hard to describe. It's not about Beowulf. It's about humanity. It's about your life and your future and your role in the world and stories, and this is a 10 out of 10 book. So that was my journey into classics. I think I could have done a better job making a theme and maybe picking books that were all on the same theme. So I think I'll try that next time I decide to read a bunch of classics. But I did find some great ones. If you're going to read any of these books, read Grendel. Oh my goodness, read Grendel. It was beautiful. Thanks for watching. Okay, bye.